Okay, well, listen, I'm gonna start because I want to get our full hour in. So first and foremost, I'd like to thank everybody who's joining us today to hear this very important panel discussion about cybersecurity. Very thankful for our partnership with Res Cyber Strategies. I'm very thankful that Jamie is here to help moderate this panel. For those of you who don't know, my name is Elliot Richardson. I am the president and co-founder of the Small Business Advocacy Council. We are a nonpartisan organization that is laser focused on advocating for the small business community. We work in Springfield, we work on a federal level, we work locally to try to move public policy that will help small businesses recover from the pandemic and thrive in the future. So, can't go through all of our legislative initiatives right now because we have other things to talk about today. I'm going to turn this over to Jamie. And once again, thank you for your partnership, Jamie. And thank you for putting together this fantastic panel.
Thank you, Elliot. Appreciate that intro and for the SBAC for hosting this important discussion. It's great to be with everyone today. By quick way of intro, my name is Jamie Singer. I'm an Executive Vice President and Director of Data Security, Privacy, and Crisis Communications at Resolute Strategic Services. I lead our Res Cyber Strategies group, which works alongside cyber insurers, cyber attorneys, and forensics firms to advise organizations on strategic communications and reputation management before, during, and after significant cyber events. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by two individuals with whom I have the privilege of working regularly, and I'm looking forward to hearing their insights into this increasing cyber challenge facing small and mid-sized organizations. So I'd like to introduce Luke Green. Luke is a breach response services manager at Beasley, one of the leading insurers in the cybersecurity space. And I'd also like to introduce Michael Waters, who is a shareholder and member of the tech transactions and data privacy practice at Polsinelli, a law firm with extensive incident response experience. And Michael's based here in Chicago. So Luke and Michael, thank you so much for joining us today. In terms of the format of today's event, I'll be moderating the first half of today's discussion with Luke and Mike, and then we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for your questions. But as you think of those questions during the course of today's discussion, we encourage you to use the chat feature to submit your questions, and we'll either answer those in real time or at the end as appropriate. So why are we here today? It's no secret that the cyber threat landscape has continued to evolve and intensify in terms of the volume, the sophistication, and the impact of cyber attacks. No company or industry is immune today, from professional services firms to healthcare organizations to colleges to technology companies and even critical infrastructure. I'm sure many of you saw this week the news headlines that have been circulating about how hackers were briefly able to access the control system for a municipal water supply in Florida. And so while there is a lot of media conversation focused on cybersecurity threats impacting large organizations, the Fire Eyes of the world, believe it or not, it is actually the smaller and mid-sized businesses that are acutely at risk today. What we're seeing is that SMBs are disproportionately being targeted by threat actors. For example, the median company that fell victim to ransomware last quarter had only 234 employees on average. So threat actors are targeting smaller organizations often because they assume these companies are under-resourced and underprepared. And unfortunately, the ramifications of these incidents can be significant for your organization, operationally, financially, legally, and of course, reputationally. Essentially, managing cybersecurity risk is now the cost of doing business today. That's the bad news. The good news is these risks can be mitigated through an emphasis on proactive education, training, awareness building, and preparedness, which is why we're all here today. So today we'll be discussing both how you can better prepare your organization to be cybersecurity resilient in advance of a significant cyber event, and then of course, our thoughts on what you can do if, and frankly, when something goes bump in the night. So before we dive into the what, wanted to first take a step back and discuss the who. Specifically, who are cyber insurers and cyber attorneys, and what do they do, and how can they partner with your organizations to assist? So Luke, I'll start off with you to talk a little bit about the role of a cyber insurer and how and when you get engaged on these matters.
Sure, thanks, Jamie. So, CyberInsure, we're here to assist when you have an incident. You know, my role as breach response services manager is outside the traditional claims handler. I'm your first point of response when an incident happens. I'm down in the trenches, you know, with that insured, helping them figure out what law firms to work with, what forensics firms, helping draw up that initial plan that that will help your organization navigate through it. You know, beyond my role, there are the claims adjusters and underwriters as well, and you know, they would work with your organization to assess what your risks are, you know, help with that risk transference.
Great. And Luke, you know, quick question for you, which I'm sure is on the minds of folks here. You know, given the budget squeezes that are going on, why should smaller organizations prioritize cyber insurance in their budgets?
Sure. So, and this is going to be cliche, and you already said it once, but it's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when. You know, with the threat landscape constantly changing, you know, disclosure of sensitive data used to be one of the primary concerns in assessing risk, but you know, but businesses are increasingly facing threats to their ability to conduct normal operations. You know, a ransomware incident can shut down your production line or your point of sale system. Then, you know, in responding to the incident, the cost of legal, the cost of forensics and data recovery can be very high. And you know, your carrier likely has negotiated rates in place with experts in the field and are going to work with you to prioritize a quick and efficient response. You know, on top of that, even the smallest ransomware demands I see most days aren't less than $50,000. So you're either spending a little bit now or spending a lot later when something happens that you don't have coverage for it. So you really can't afford not to have cyber insurance.
Great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Michael, we'll turn to you now to talk a little bit about the role of Cyber Counsel.
Sure, thanks, Jamie. So part of the role of being a cyber attorney is a traditional legal role. So if your organization experiences a data incident, you may have legal obligations arising out of that incident. For example, if people's personal information was acquired, you may have to let them know, you may have to let your business partners know, you could have to let regulators know. And then there may be resulting regulatory investigations or litigation arising out of the incident. And as a traditional attorney, our role is to help you analyze those obligations, carry out your obligations, and then deal with the fallout. But this space is a little bit unusual in the legal field in that I'd say half of my job is actually a project management role. So if you have particularly a large scale event, there are going to be a number of different moving pieces. You may have to rely on an outside IT forensics firm to help you investigate the situation. If you have to provide notice to a large number of people, you may have to engage a mail center or a call center or coordinate credit monitoring. Sometimes you may have to rely on Jamie and her team to provide that outside PR crisis management service. And if you haven't gone through one of these events before, that can be a little bit daunting, particularly when you start to add in FBI outreach and things along those lines. So really part of our role is to help oversee the response process, coordinate all those different moving parts, and sort of help you make it through the event successfully. And then finally, being attorneys, the attorney-client relationship and privilege exists to our communications. And we can, in some respects, cover some of the investigation by the attorney-client privilege. So for example, when we do need to bring in that outside forensics, we oftentimes will make it a three-party agreement whereby the forensic firm is helping us help you analyze your legal obligations. And by doing that, it increases the likelihood that that investigation is privileged.
Thanks, Michael. And, you know, similar, obviously, with crisis communications firms, often will do that tri-party contract with you, you know, for similar reasons. If you could also touch on, I know we have several attorneys on the call today, how you work or collaborate with internal counsel.
Yeah, so our so from a traditional legal standpoint, our role is pretty similar. So internal counsel may already have a decent understanding of the regulations that apply as it relates to data incidents. Oftentimes, it's a little bit of a new experience for them, so we can certainly assist on that front. We also have worked extensively with different regulators who open up investigations, whether that be attorneys general or industry regulators like the Department of Health and Human Services, and we can help navigate that process. And then again, to the extent that in-house counsel is comfortable having us serve that project management role, we're happy to do so. But we certainly don't want to step on any toes. And if in-house counsel prefers to sort of take that role on him or herself, that is perfectly fine with us as well. We also know that some organizations have really strong relationships with an outside law firm or particular outside attorney who knows the organization very well, knows how the incident may be impacting the organization. We're obviously more than happy to work with those folks as well.
Excellent. I will briefly touch on the role of a strategic communications firm like Res Cyber Strategies. So we typically get involved in one of three phases. The first is on the front end or pre-breach side, and this is where we would work with organizations to help build that preparedness and readiness in advance of an issue. So this includes developing or enhancing your incident response crisis communications plans, doing scenario planning around timely cyber threats and issues, as well as designing and facilitating crisis trainings and tabletop exercises to really put your organization through the motions of what it would be like to respond to a fictitious yet realistic issue. And this is really the best way that we've seen to build muscle memory for responding effectively to these issues. On the incident response side, when something goes bump in the night, we often will get engaged, as I mentioned, by a Pulcinelli or by a Beasley to help clients with their strategic communications response, because these issues do tend to attract the scrutiny and attention of media, regulators, elected officials, your customers, employees, and other stakeholders. So our role is to provide that guidance on your internal and external communication strategies in support of your legal notification efforts that someone like Michael would be advising on. We also are sort of providing that arms and legs to help with the actual material and messaging development. There's a lot of materials that usually need to be created for this: talking points, Q&As, employee communications, social media messaging, etc. Oftentimes you'll need to put information on your website, so we can help with the content and a multi-stakeholder communication strategy. And then following an incident, a lot of organizations like to sort of wash their hands of it, but the work might not be over. It's important to take a look at any type of reputation recovery that your brand might need to enhance trust that might have been lost from your stakeholders. So this will include taking a look at traditional media attention, social media conversation, surveys of your key stakeholders to understand where sentiment is and what we might need to do from a communications and engagement standpoint to put our best foot forward following an incident. So as you can see here, a key theme is collaboration among the different groups that Michael, Luke, and I have talked about. And the whole concept is to create a seamless, coordinated approach to responding to these incidents. So now that we have this grounding, Mike and Luke, I'd love to continue the dialogue around some of the key questions and concerns that we've been hearing from small and mid-sized organizations. So to that end, the first question, in your spaces, how are you seeing threat actors targeting smaller and mid-sized businesses? What kind of tactics are they using that you're seeing in your spaces? Luke, you want to start this answer?
Sure, absolutely. So, one of the things that I hear very often is, we're just a small business in the middle of nowhere. We never thought anything was going to happen to us. And while your organization in many cases may not have been a specific target, bad actors are out there scanning the internet for open RDP ports. You know, they're sending out phishing emails that get changed from one contact to another. So you may be caught up in something without even being the direct target. So and basically, you know, ransomware actors will, you know, they'll get a foothold in your environment when somebody clicks one of those phishing messages. So, you know, it really comes down to you're at risk if you're connected to the internet, even if you're not being specifically targeted.
That makes sense. Michael, what are you seeing from the legal side?
Yeah, so I'd say over the past 2 years, although we see all sorts of different types of security incidents, there are really two that we've seen far and away more frequently than others. And those are email compromise situations and ransomware events. With respect to email compromise situations, so those are basically incidents in which somebody is able to get complete access to your email account. That occurs typically as a result of a phishing email that you receive that in some way convinces you to give up your user credentials. What has made this tricky is that we've all been taught that if we carefully scrutinize the email that we receive, we can oftentimes see that it may be malicious because the email address that the emails come from is spoofed. Maybe the name of the organization has been changed slightly. But what's happening nowadays is somebody will get access to my email account, and then from my email account, send off phishing emails to everybody in my contacts. That then means that you're receiving an email from somebody that you know. It's not a spoofed email address. It may say something like, I've sent you a secure email to access it, enter in your Outlook credentials, you put in your credentials, nothing happens, but on the back end, somebody now has the ability to access your email account. And then once they have access to your email account, we're seeing them try to commit wire fraud and things along those lines by you know, creating fake invoices and whatnot. On that end, you know, the easiest way to prevent that is to implement multi-factor authentication. So basically, if you accidentally give up your email credentials, somebody has your email address, they have your password, they at least still wouldn't have that extra piece of authentication that they need to access the account. And then just, you know, employee training and kind of beating into employees' heads how vigilant we need to be about phishing emails. With respect to ransomware events, so those events typically originate from phishing emails. So again, that phishing email training is very important, and open RDP ports, as Luke mentioned. And basically an open RDP port, it's a remote desktop protocol. It's what allows, say, like your IT person to access the IT system remotely. Oftentimes those ports don't have complex passwords, or maybe they don't have passwords at all. And there are ways that the threat actors can basically kind of scan the internet, try to find those open RDP ports, and then they don't care what kind of organization you are. If they realize that they have the ability to get into somebody's system, they'll go ahead and do that, and then find a way to deploy ransomware or cause other mischief.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's amazing how many different sort of vectors of attack we're seeing. The other thing, you know, that I've been seeing in the small, mid-sized business is sort of that accidental employee error that sort of results in an issue, whether it's a lost laptop that contained personally identifiable information or a stolen thumb drive. Michael, are you seeing that as well? And what can organizations do about sort of the accidental error that leads to a security event?
Yeah, so accidents always happen. In addition, you know, people break into cars, they steal laptops, they steal devices. On that end, really, there are a couple of things that you can do. Most importantly is to encrypt those devices, whether it be that laptop or that thumb drive. That's important because then if you lose that device or it's stolen, the bad actor doesn't have the ability to access the information. From a legal standpoint, it also can get you out of having to provide breach notification to individuals and to regulators. The breach notification laws have a specific carve out if data has been encrypted. And again, the thought is if the bad actor can't actually get at the data, there's no need to notify people. And then, anytime you're transmitting data on a device, we typically say kind of minimum extent necessary. If you can keep data from kind of leaving your systems, it obviously reduces the likelihood of something occurring, or if something occurs, at least reduces the scope of the incident.
Great. So since the title of our session today is "So you've been breached, now what?" it's probably only appropriate to ask this question of you both. So say one of the scenarios we just described, happens to an organization on the phone today. What would you suggest are those first critical steps that a small or mid-sized organization should take? Luke, maybe we'll start with you from your thoughts on the insurer side.
Sure. So one of the first things you can do is, if you have an incident response plan, take it out of the drawer and go to it. If you don't have it, that's okay too. There's a lot of people out there who can assist and who have been through this. So, if you have cyber insurance, calling them right away. You may think of them more as all right, I'm going to deal with this and then submit my costs later. But somebody like me, my role is to help you in those kind of emergent situations. So you're going to be trying to figure out, okay, how do we get back up and running? I have a list of vendors that I work with that we could help bring in around the country that can assist with that. I'd recommend somebody like Mike Waters to come in and Jamie to come in and assist with incidents. So I think, that's really, going to your cyber insurer, going to the experts to assist is a really good first step.
Great. And then Mike, so say, Luke has recommended you and you're involved. What are those sort of first critical action items that you advise an organization on?
Yeah. So, I guess a couple of things. One is, if you haven't already reached out to insurance, that's something that we're going to discuss. But from a very high 1,000-foot level, although we are going to be ultimately concerned with things like your legal obligations arising out of the incident, really our primary concern is to mitigate whatever is going on, try to remediate it, and then we're going to analyze sort of what you need to do from there. So, for example, if you have a potential network intrusion, we're not going to start talking about breach notification laws right off the bat. We're going to see, do you have the internal resources to secure your systems? If not, let's bring in some outside technical assistance to help with that. Then we're going to try to get a sense of the scope of the incident. Before we start notifying people or regulators or customers or others, we want to get a real sense of what's actually happened. That may be, just having a conversation with you. It may be relying on outside forensics to do an investigation to see what information was accessed or acquired. In the example of a lost or stolen laptop, it may be getting a sense of what's actually on that device. And then once we have that information, we'll move ahead and analyze the legal obligations. Depending on the severity of the situation, there's some other things that sometimes we'll do immediately. So sometimes we'll have to reach out to law enforcement. In ransomware events, sometimes we'll bring in people who specialize in negotiating with threat actors through those sorts of crises and things along those lines.
Great. Yeah. So obviously a lot of fact finding, information gathering at first, though I will also offer, sometimes these events become out of your control quickly. If, for example, a Brian Krebs has scooped you and there's already information out there in the media. So often what we'll advise is making sure right away we have that holding statement nailed of what we would say to inquiring media or inquiring customers, and making sure that we're monitoring media coverage, your social media conversation and channels to see if there's any public chatter that might have to accelerate the timeline of some of these events and and communications. So I think that was great in terms of what to do. Mike, what would you say are the common missteps or mistakes that you see companies make that you would encourage this group to avoid?
Yeah, so I think to Luke's point, he mentioned break out that incident response plan. I think one of the important things is to give thought to these issues ahead of time. What you don't want to do is have particularly a significant incident that impacts your network. Maybe it's a ransomware event that encrypts data, and not have at least a sense of who should we be reaching out to assist us throughout this process. I have been at panels where people have broken out their incident response plans that they paid 6 figures to have somebody create, and it's a binder worth of documents. I honestly don't think most organizations need that, but I think having an understanding of who within the organization needs to be brought in, what are their roles going to be, what third parties do we need to reach out to, even put in your plan just contact information for those third parties. So if you have cyber insurance, you want to know who our carrier is, how do we put them on notice, how do we start taking advantage of the resources that they have available to them, and so you can get that process moving quickly. Where we see a lot of organizations stumble is those first 2 or 3 days. They really don't have a great sense of what it is they need to be doing. Another area where we sometimes see missteps, and you may be able to speak to this, is with respect to communication. So it's not always possible, but generally speaking, we typically recommend that you get a good understanding of what has actually occurred, who may have been impacted, how they may have been impacted, before you start communicating about the situation publicly. Where we sometimes see missteps is when people communicate information that ultimately turns out to be wrong because they don't have yet a full sense of the situation. Then that harms the organization from the standpoint that people lose some trust in what they're hearing from the organization. And sometimes you actually can create a bigger incident than it turns out to be by getting out ahead of the story before you know what's happening.
I agree, Mike. It's interesting because the sort of typical lesson of crisis management 101 is, communicate quickly. But I think these cyber issues are a little bit nuanced and different. And to your point, rushing that communication with details that you aren't confident in can only erode trust on the back end. And so making sure that there's a balancing act of how quickly to communicate while the investigation is ongoing is critical. The other area I'd say that I've seen some missteps is there's typically a lot of immediate focus on customer communications or what to say to the media. And a lot of organizations forget about their own employees, and employees are both conduits to customers and also can be sources of leaks to media. So making sure you've thought through, what you want to tell employees, and more importantly, how you want them to escalate, questions and inquiries so they're staying on message. Luke, we talked about ransomware, earlier. Obviously, continues to be a lot of attention there. We're seeing, as you mentioned, the ransom amounts increasing. We're seeing very sophisticated and evolved tactics with ransomware, such as data exfiltration and DDoS attacks. So how would you advise an organization on that critical question of payment? And what should organizations be looking for in their cyber insurance policy when it comes to ransomware coverage?
Sure. So one of the things that I always caveat the conversation with is that, the insurance company is not going to take a position on whether you should pay or not. What they are going to do is say, we make the resources available so that you can make that decision, because really it is a decision for you to make. With that said, making sure that that you're working with experts that are that are specialized, that can know which threat actors you're working with, that can know the likelihood of success if you were to make a payment based on the threat group. Then beyond that, you want to make sure that you have enough cyber extortion coverage. That's obviously important, because we have run into scenarios where somebody was underinsured and they are left not able to address a potential issue. While you can negotiate with the attackers, it's going to depend by threat group what level of success you have. And then beyond that, also making sure you have coverage for business interruption losses and the cost of data recovery, since even if you make a payment, it's not an instantaneous process to get back up and running. It may take a couple days or a week to be fully back up and running. So making sure that you have cover for the lost sales, the lost any other forms of business interruption is really key. So working with your insurance broker and the underwriter can really help in those situations.
Great. And Mike, what counsel do you usually advise in ransomware? And with these new tactics around data exfiltration, does that factor into whether you encourage organizations to pay or not?
Yeah, it definitely does. And I will say it's sort of our baseline position that, if we can get through the situation without making a ransom payment, that's obviously sort of the preferred way forward. But it's not always possible. I would say if we were having this discussion 3 or 4 years ago, I'd tell you that maybe 90% of our clients were able to get through a ransomware situation without having to make a ransom payment. These days, it's probably more like 50-50. And there are really 2 reasons for that. First is a lot of our clients didn't have to make payments 3 or 4 years ago because they had good backups from which they were able to recover from. So their systems are encrypted, but they can recover from backups. Maybe they lose a day or two's worth of data, but it's not a huge deal. They're able to carry on. One thing that the bad actors have gotten very good at doing is encrypting those backups as well, which then creates a situation in which an organization literally just has no way to access any of its data. And although it may not want to make that ransom payment, sometimes it feels like it really has no choice but to do so. The second thing, which Jamie and Luke alluded to, is that a lot of these bad actors have realized that they have a little bit more leverage over you if they not only encrypt your data, but take some data from your system before encryption and basically say that they're either going to post this information online, or maybe they do post some of the information online and say that they'll take it down if you make a payment. In those situations, it is typically our recommendation still not to make the payment for a couple of reasons. One is a lot of times you've already suffered kind of whatever the PR fallout is from that. 2 is from a breach notification standpoint, somebody's acquired the data, you're still going to have to let people know. And 3rd is, although we have sort of a good history of getting decryption keys that work and get organizations back up and running when data is encrypted, really there's no kind of trust that the bad actor is actually going to delete this information or not use it in some form or fashion going forward. That being said, these are sometimes very difficult decisions depending on the sensitivity of the data taken. Sometimes it's pretty benign information about the organization, but sometimes it can be extremely sensitive. So for example, we had a matter involving a plastic surgery practice to the stars, where they had taken all sorts of information, including before and after photos of people who had come in for like breast augmentation surgery and that sort of thing. And the threat actor was threatening to post that information about these celebrities unless payment was made. That really puts an organization in a tight bind. Really impacts, the future of their business, and so those can be tough decisions to work through.
Yeah, I agree, Mike. I think the nature of the data involved really can influence these decisions, and I think especially in healthcare, as you mentioned, those decisions are harder. I'm working with a mental health healthcare organization, and because of the sensitivity of the data that was copied from the threat actors, they didn't want that out there and paid. So I think, each organization has to make their own kind of financial, legal, and reputational calculus, but it's certainly not easy. So switching gears to the sort of, what organizations can do proactively to better prepare and mitigate risk around these issues. Mike, I know you mentioned that the sort of 100-page binder incident response plan is less useful today. What would you say are those must-haves on the front end that organizations should be thinking about?
Yeah, so typically an incident response plan, even if it's a pared down simple plan, is going to address a few things. So one is typically you'll have a team of people around the incident response team. These are the individuals who are going to lead the organization's efforts if there is an incident. And then there's going to be some way to make sure those individuals are notified of an incident within the organization. So if somebody comes to the IT department with an issue, they know sort of when to raise the issue to the incident response team. Same thing for employees. And then those people on the incident response team are at least going to be, generally familiar with kind of the process the organization is going to run through to deal with the situation. That incident response plan should also identify third parties who should be notified and at least have, some basic instructions on when they should be notified. So you'll want to make sure you have, your insurance in there, your outside law firm, maybe a preferred forensic vendor or two. Oftentimes we'll have information on law enforcement outreach that can be done. And then depending on your organization, there could be other third parties. So if, for example, you're owned by a private equity firm or somebody else that has a big stake in your organization, it may be that you need to notify them. And, I think a lot of plans will sort of address what happens on days 2, 3, 4, 10 of an incident response. But more than anything, just making sure the right people within the organization are aware that they have a plan and how to kick things off, and that what third parties to go to is a great starting point.
Great. And Luke, what is the insurance market sort of perspective on preparedness, and is an emphasis on that part of your discussions with insureds in terms of coverage?
Sure, absolutely. So proactive preparedness is definitely something that the underwriters are looking at. These days, some insurers won't even look at a business in certain sectors if they don't have multi-factor authentication. The same thing goes for endpoint detection and response tools, backups of data, email scanning and filters, among other things.
Great. So last question from me before we open it up to the group. Obviously 2020 was kind of the wild, wild west in terms of cyber, with what we saw with, a movement toward remote work and the vulnerabilities created there, the rise and evolution of ransomware. What do you guys predict for this year in terms of the threat landscape? What are the watch outs organizations should be thinking about? Luke, I'll start with you.
So I think that ransomware is going to continue to be an issue. The same thing with cyber extortion and stolen data. Beyond that, especially with things like SolarWinds that occurred, your people are going to need to put a lot of focus on third party and even fourth party risk. Knowing who your vendors are, knowing who their vendors are, who, and who could potentially access your data. So, I think that, it's obviously, it's going to be very data centric, with that ransomware and cyber extortion, but also that, those vendor risks are going to be out there as well.
Great. And Mike, from your perspective?
Yeah, so I think, the bad actors seem to be very focused on schemes that will make them the most money with the least amount of effort. And what I mean by that is I've been in this space for about 17 years, and I've seen the types of attacks change over time. And more and more, the threat actors seem to be going to things that will get them paid without a whole lot of effort. And for example, when I first got into this space, one of the things that we would oftentimes see are breaches involving credit card information. And back in the day, it used to be that if you got somebody's credit card number, you would actually have to physically create counterfeit credit cards and then take them into stores and use them. And so there is a tremendous amount of legwork involved in that. You have to, first of all, try to get the credit card numbers, then you have to get the material to make the credit cards, you have to make the credit cards, then you have to go into the store, make the purchase, and hope you don't get caught. I mentioned earlier that email compromises and ransomware events are the two types of events that we're seeing with the greatest frequency. And those are both ways and or types of incidents where a bad actor can get paid with minimal effort. So with the email compromise situation, it's literally just sending out phishing emails. Some people respond, you get access to their email account. And then what the bad actor does is they'll see, is this somebody who sends or receives invoices or wires? If yes, they'll just insert themselves into the process by telling a vendor, hey, we've changed our bank account information. The next time you make payment, send it to this account. And somebody sends money to that account. The bad actor has done nothing other than send out a phishing email and a couple of follow-up emails with a bank account, and they've gotten paid. On the ransomware side, you know, they can sit in Eastern Europe or somewhere, get into an organization's system, encrypt the data, and from there, they really don't have to do anything other than negotiate with you and give you a Bitcoin wallet to make payment to. So I think we're going to continue to see those email compromise situations and those ransomware events, and to further leverage, get leverage on people, we'll probably see more data exfil in connection with those ransomware events.
So needless to say, it'll be another busy year. Great. Lauren, I think now would be a good time to sort of, hear from the audience. I know some questions were submitted in advance of the event, and maybe we have some in the chat. So feel free to let us know.
One question that came in advance, Jamie, maybe best for you, is when should you go to the press?
Yeah, so, Luke, Mike, and I were actually joking about this ahead of time because our ideal answer is never, if you can help it. In all seriousness, sometimes there are legal requirements that mandate that you have to proactively issue a media notice in a particular market based on the number of individuals affected and the laws, which I know Mike can speak to. But when there's not a proactive media notice requirement, we don't typically recommend going proactively to the media. Media should be viewed as a conduit or a vehicle to your key stakeholders. But the problem is media are going to filter that message the way they want to sell newspapers. So it's more ideal to go directly to your stakeholders that you're trying to communicate with, whether it's your customers, your employees, your partners, to make sure your messages are resonating. That said, it's always important to be prepared for media scrutiny and having, template response statements, standby statements ready to go in case that does happen. In those moments, I would say, there is some breach fatigue out there. And so the goal of a media response is really, honestly, to make it as boring as possible for the journalist on the other end. And so typically we will recommend using written statements that don't give a lot away, but demonstrate how seriously the organization is taking the incident, and using that to respond to media. Live interviews, can be difficult environments, especially with very savvy cyber trade and technology reporters who want you to go down that rabbit hole. So in very rare instances, do we recommend, live media interviews being an important vehicle for this. But all this to say, it's a good step right now in your organization to think about what would be that holding statement you would say in a ransomware incident. What happens if Brian Krebs hears from his sources that your stakeholders' data is out there on the dark web? These are scenarios that you can start planning for now and at least having something on paper as a starting point. Mike or Luke, anything you'd add to that?
Sure. So I largely echo what Jamie said. And from a legal standpoint, there are state breach notification laws and some industry-specific laws that apply to healthcare, financial services, education, and some other industries that require you to provide notice if somebody's personal information has been accessed or acquired. So typically what we'll do if time permits, is again, do a thorough investigation, try to get a sense of, was anybody's information accessed or acquired? If so, whose? And then we'll provide the requisite legal notice to those individuals. And to make sure we're not providing any misinformation or scaring people unnecessarily, we'll wait until we have all of that information. That can be fairly easy. So for example, if you have a stolen laptop and it's unencrypted, what we'll do is we'll basically data mine that laptop, see if it contains anybody's personal information. If so, we'll notify the people that we need to notify as soon as we're able to do so. There may, however, be situations where you don't have the luxury of time. In particular, those ransomware events. If your systems are encrypted and you are physically unable to service your customers, people are going to notice pretty quickly. And before you've had the ability to complete that forensic investigation, you're probably going to start getting questions. In those situations, we'll oftentimes work with Jamie and her team to come up with a game plan on how to communicate about the situation. It can be a little tricky because a lot of times people have questions that you do not yet have answers to, such as, did this incident impact my data? Has anybody taken my data? On day 1, 2, or 3, we typically don't have answers to those questions. So the response may be a little nuanced, but we work through those issues with you.
There's not much I can add to that. I mean, making sure that when you do go public, that you're 100% certain of that information is really key.
Great, we've got a few more questions that came. Do small businesses have any quality that make them more nimble than large organizations in responding to a cyber incident?
Luke, you want to take that one?
Sure. So that's a really good question. When in working with some large organizations, in working with higher education, where there's a lot of different departments involved in an incident, sometimes that can get in the way. Smaller businesses with smaller hierarchies, more direct lines of communication among departments, they are able to respond quicker. So I think in many cases, smaller businesses, it can be an advantage to have those smaller hierarchies, and so you're able to make sure that some rogue employee isn't going off and talking to the press without you knowing, because everybody's on message.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's clear who the decision makers are often, and who has that accountability in smaller organizations, especially those that have thought through their response team in advance. And so that consistency of message, I agree, Luke, is probably easier in many respects for smaller organizations. But of course, sometimes, not having access to as many resources as larger organizations can also limit a response. But yeah, certainly there's a superpower in sort of being smaller and nimble.
I've got another question for Luke. How does an insurer know or verify that a company has backup systems and dual authentication, et cetera, when they're looking for insurance?
Sure. So in most cases, we'll ask in the application. Especially in recent years, we've become very, very good at knowing which questions to ask, and we've started including in the applications or in supplemental applications. What are your backup status? Do you have that multi-factor? So, we're in most cases, we're relying on what information is being provided to us.
And one follow-up for you. How are policy limits determined in cyber policies, and how does this if they have adequate coverage?
And I do apologize, you were breaking up a little bit there. Would you mind repeating it?
Of course. How are policy limits cyber policy, and how does this know adequate coverage?
So, and it's a little outside my role, so I'll do my best to answer that. I think that the underwriters are working very closely to factor in risk. So looking at detractors like not having multi-factor authentication, not having proper backups, not having endpoint detection tools are something that is going to increase your premiums versus having something like those proactive tools is going to decrease your premiums. Add to that, the industry sector that you're in, healthcare, of course, is always at high risk, and because of the potential sensitivity of data, and I think that if you combine those things, that's going to play a big role in determining your limits and your premiums.
We have a few minutes left. I do want to open it to the group. If there are questions you have, you want to ask live, you can unmute yourself. Otherwise, I can track down a few other questions that are coming into the chat, but just want to give people a chance to unmute if they want to ask something.
Yeah, sure. I have a question. So we deal with obviously small business owners all the time, mid-sized business owners, and I think there may be sort of a mindset of it's not going to happen to me. So, I guess it's for anybody on the panel, Michael, Jamie, or Luke. What do you say to those business folks who aren't necessarily thinking about this at all because they feel that the threat of being hacked or held up for money is just so far removed that it doesn't push them to act? Anybody can start.
Well, I'll start real quick. I mean, based on the work I've been doing in this space, again, the data that I have is small and mid-sized organizations are my predominant clients that we're seeing in this. And I think the best way to sort of force the conversation around awareness and education is to go through one of those tabletop exercises where we run through a fictitious scenario, because that's really how organizations can see how this can manifest, how it can blow up, how your reputation, your financials can be impacted. And so almost going through that motion of thinking through the worst case scenario, I think is a great way to sort of push organizations to think about this more proactively. Mike and Luke, I don't know if you have anything else to contribute with that.
Yeah, so I think there are sometimes threat actors will go after specific organizations because the organization has trade secrets they're interested in, or they have a lot of sensitive information. We saw for a while that healthcare organizations were being targeted by a particular threat actor group who just wanted all of our health information. That being said, a lot of events are more of what I would call the pray and spray and pray type of events, or situations where people, again, are just like scanning the internet for open RDP ports. So those phishing email situations, it's really just a situation of they send out phishing emails, whoever responds, that's who they're going after, irrespective of the organization that they work for, and whether it's a large organization or a small organization. A lot of organizations think, we have very good security, and therefore this cannot happen to us as a result of that. I think, the SolarWinds incident is kind of a good example of how anybody is vulnerable. That impacted government organizations. It impacted FireEye, who itself is a security organization. Really, nobody is immune. And then the other thing that we hear sometimes is, we're smart about this. We realize that we are not privacy or security experts. So what we've done is we've outsourced a lot of this. We've outsourced our IT, or we utilize. I see there's a question here about CRMs like Salesforce. We outsource certain database tools that we use. The way the breach notification laws work is if your vendor has an incident that impacts your employees or your customers' data, you're on the hook for it. And we do see a lot of vendor breaches as well. So, that's something that you have to certainly be aware of.
Yeah, no, thank you for touching on the question. I didn't know if anyone else wanted to comment on the question that came in the chat regarding CRMs. Can customers be affected by a cyber incident if they are using a CRM tool?
So I can expand on that a little bit. So I touched on this, but so the way the breach notification laws work is if somebody gives you their personal information, you become the data owner, whether that's your employee or a customer or somebody else. If you share that information with a third party, and they have an incident, their only obligation, unless the contract you have with them says otherwise, is to let you know, and then you're the one ultimately who has to notify individuals and regulators. When you're working with a third party that has databases like Salesforce, there's a big incident involving a company called Blackbaud over the past year. You're the one who may feel the brunt of that. And so one thing to keep in mind, and this is hard when you're a small business because oftentimes you don't have a whole lot of leverage when you're negotiating contracts, but to the extent possible, you want to make sure that if that entity is one that has an incident, you're going to be indemnified for it, or they're going to at least cover the costs of notification or something along those lines, so that you're not going to be significantly harmed financially because they had an incident. It's not quite the same as Salesforce, but another thing to note is over the past couple of years, we have seen quite a few ransomware incidents involving outsourced MSPs or managed services providers. So a lot of times smaller businesses will outsource all of their IT services. And again, that can be great because those are people who should have greater expertise in security. However, there are a couple of threat actor groups, including one called Sodinokibi, who will actually get into these IT vendor systems and then deploy ransomware to all of their downstream customers, which means what happens is your systems are encrypted, which is horrible, but then you don't have really ownership over the ability to get back up and running. You're relying on that IT vendor who is itself trying to get back up and running and dealing with 100 other customers who are all calling and emailing and complaining, and it puts you in a very difficult situation. So there, in addition to having contractual terms in place that address some of these issues, it can be good to give thought to, okay, if we do have an event like this, do we have at least backups of key documents or key databases that we can work off of, knowing that we may not kind of hold our destiny in our hands and we may be reliant on this third party to get the rest of our systems back up.
Great. Jamie, I'm going to turn it back to you. I know we're at the top of the hour.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for those great questions. As we close up here, I think you've probably heard a key theme here is the importance of investing in preparedness. And, one of the tools that can help with that is our Res Cybersecurity app. As many of you may know, Resolute has partnered with the SBAC to actually create a customized cybersecurity app designed for small and medium-sized businesses. So encourage you to check out the app if you haven't downloaded it already. If you have downloaded it, we've made some updates that we encourage you to check out. Again, this is to help with awareness building, education. There's alerts for key articles and alerts from CISA. There's also a self-assessment tool that you can take to evaluate your organization's own unique level of preparedness and take some time now to close those gaps. So I know we're at the top of the hour. Mike, Luke, thank you so much for your contributions and insights. To Elliot and SBAC, thank you so much for hosting this very important discussion. Here's our contact information, and we'll also send through a follow-up email to everyone so that you have it at the ready in case something does go bump in the night. But really appreciate the discussion today and hope you all stay well.
Thank you, Jamie.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.